Thank you very much for coming to this presentation. 在中国的朋友们，下午好。My name is Xiao, and I'm presenting my research on the regulation of loot boxes in video games. I was very much looking forward to going home to Beijing to make this presentation in person, but I'm glad that we're able to meet remotely nonetheless. This is an extended abstract presentation as my academic background is in law. This paper will not appear in the proceedings, but a preprint version of this paper is available at the link at the bottom of this slide. Thank you for having me, and I hope you find this presentation interesting. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept of a loot box. At least one previous presentation at this conference dealt with this game mechanic, the paper by Dr. Dominic Xiao. However, I will provide a quick background summary. Loot boxes are these gambling-like mechanics in video games that players can purchase using real-world money to obtain randomized rewards. There are also loot boxes that can be obtained without paying real-world money, but I am concerned by loot boxes that do require payment, and these might be referred to as paid loot boxes. When I speak of loot boxes for the rest of this presentation, I mean paid loot boxes. Loot boxes are conceptually similar to gambling because the player or the gambler both spent real-world money to bet on a chance for a random event to occur. Indeed, links have been found between disordered gambling and loot box spending, suggesting that some players might be at risk of harm. Given the potential harms of loot boxes, specifically players overspending money, these mechanics have been the subject of public controversy and regulatory scrutiny. One question that is very important for us to try to understand then is just how prevalent loot boxes are in the video games that are currently available. Previous research in the UK has found 77 of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games contain loot boxes in mid-2021. Another study in China has found that the prevalence rate was much higher, sitting at 91%. I think this reflects partly some different cultural attitudes towards these mechanics. The research question that I sought to answer with this study is whether Belgium's ban on loot boxes has been successful. Belgium banned all implementations of paid loot boxes, unlike every other country in the world. So the product should no longer be available in that national market. The prevalence rate in Belgium should be 0%. We know from media reports that some companies have removed the ability to purchase loot boxes from the Belgian version of their game, whilst other companies removed their games that rely on loot boxes to monetize from Belgium entirely. However, when I looked at the highest grossing list of games in Belgium, I noticed that Genshin Impact, or in Chinese, Yuanshen, still appeared in the highest grossing list in Belgium, which seemed slightly perplexing, given that that game relies almost entirely on a loot box mechanic to monetize, and therefore, if loot boxes are banned, this game should not be in the highest grossing list. So the question I had was whether or not I can still find loot boxes in Belgian versions of these games, despite the ban on loot boxes. So I traveled to Belgium physically to conduct the data collection for this study. This meant that Belgian law applied to me. I thought that this was a superior methodology as compared to using a VPN whilst sitting in a different country, because the law technically did not apply to me if I was in a different country. I played the 100 highest grossing iPhone games in Belgium, and I found that 82% of them still contained a paid loot box. That is higher than the 77% in the UK. So there's a saying in Chinese of 无图无真相, or in English, this might be translated to, if I cannot show you a picture, it cannot be the truth. So there you are, 2 screenshots of a loot box that I found in Belgium. You'll see that the game literally tells you what are the percentage chances of obtaining specific dragons from this silver treasure chest. You also see on the right-hand side that this is the Apple App Store payment screen. Had I pressed the double click to pay button on the side of my phone, 2.99 euros would have went to Apple and I would have obtained this loot box. Was Belgium's ban on loot boxes successful? Well, we cannot know how many games were removed from the Belgian Apple App Store, because it is in fact true that we were not able to find and could not download some video games that, for example, Nintendo said that it removed in Belgium to comply with the law. However, interestingly, 2 games were still available for download and were on the highest grossing list, but they took technical measures to prevent purchase of loot boxes from within Belgium. In the first game, whenever you try to purchase anything in the in-game store, you'll get this pop-up telling you that payment has been blocked because buying virtual items is no longer possible in Belgium. This, however, doesn't make sense, because if a game cannot sell a single thing, and it was true that in that game you could not buy the virtual currency that is used to buy loot boxes, and you also cannot buy any of the cosmetic items that had nothing to do with randomization. Nothing was purchasable in that game. So if nothing was purchasable in a game, how could it possibly be a top grossing game? This didn't make sense. Well, the second game will shed some light on why these two games were still highest grossing. So if you try to access the store normally in Belgium, you'll get this screen where it will say that there are no products available when you try to buy the virtual currency that is used to then buy loot boxes. However, if you put a VPN on, to make your IP address appear to be from a place that is outside of Belgium, you will see the virtual currency being available for sale. You'll notice here that the pricing are all in euros, demonstrating that, yes, I was accessing the Belgian Apple App Store. So it would seem that the technical measures that are used is just a simple IP check of some sort, and that it was easily circumventable with a free VPN that I put on. However, I did find a number of reviews by players that indicate that at least some players were effectively prevented from making purchases. For example, this player says that in Belgium, we can't buy chips, chips being the virtual currency that is used to engage with the loot box mechanics. And that their gameplay experience also has been affected because they were not able to get any chips by paying money and could only rely on the free chips that the game gives to them. So I would say that from these reviews that the technical measures do work to a certain limited degree, and we cannot know how well it has worked. And perhaps further qualitative research examining these reviews may reveal some more insights about when it worked and how these technical measures worked. But generally, I would say that these technical measures remained easily circumventable. Another way that companies complied with the ban is to not publish a game in Belgium at all, or to remove said game from the Belgian market once the ban came into effect. Reportedly, Blizzard Entertainment didn't publish Diablo Immortal very recently. This has been a controversial game in terms of loot boxes. Now, indeed, it was true that when I tried to find and download this game from the Belgian Apple App Store, I could not find it. However, I very easily changed my Apple ID to the UK whilst I was still within geographical Belgium and was able to download the game just like that. I was also able to play the game and access the Apple App Store payment screen, where I could have spent real-world money to purchase the premium currency that is used to then engage with the game's loot box mechanic. So was Belgium's ban on loot boxes successful? Well, it would seem that most games, 82% in fact, were still selling loot boxes and were likely relying on them to monetize, despite the ban by the Belgian Gaming Commission. 2 out of 84 possible games took technical measures to prevent loot box purchase with real-world money. Now, as I demonstrated, these were very weak technical measures, but at least these 2 games did something. Indeed, I would say that many players were able to circumvent the technical measures that were put into place, because if there was no circumvention, then these 2 games could not have made so much money and would not have appeared on the highest grossing list. However, those reviews, customer reviews, did reveal that some players at least did get prevented from purchasing loot boxes. So the measures also work to a limited degree. Removal of games from the national stores also does not work, because the player is able to very easily change their country and region settings to a different country and download the game in a country where loot boxes are not similarly regulated. So Belgium's ban has been, in my view, unsuccessful. It is rather obvious, but just saying that a product is banned without taking any action, without taking any enforcement action to ensure that that ban is put into practice is not going to be very effective. The Belgian Gaming Commission gave consumers, including children and parents, the false impression that players are safe from loot boxes because it has been banned. But in fact, these products are still widely available. I would say that this is arguably worse than doing nothing at all, because had nothing been done, children and parents and adult players alike would have been a lot more conscious of the potential harms of loot boxes, just like players in other countries are. They know that this is something that might potentially harm them, and they are aware and they're looking out for the potential dangers. However, in Belgium, because the Belgian Gaming Commission and the government have given the impression that loot boxes are now gone, parents, for example, might not educate their children about the harms of loot boxes because they think that their children could never be exposed to these mechanics and are safe. However, the truth is that they are not. Another problem with this current approach is that the non-compliant companies who are still selling loot boxes are receiving revenue in Belgium, whilst the companies that complied with the law and either removed their loot boxes or removed the game entirely are no longer making quite as much money. So it would seem that what has been done here was that compliant companies were punished, whilst non-compliant companies in fact benefited, because if I were to assume that players would spend a similar amount of money on video games, regardless of what video games are available, then the money that would have been spent on the compliant games are now being spent on the non-compliant games. Now, since I posted the preprint for my study, there's been a bit of media reporting of it on, for example, GameSpot and other media sources. I also had some reporting appear in Chinese media, Sandian, for example. Well, there was also some reporting in national Belgian news, which was the most interesting because I actually got an official response from the Belgian Minister of Justice, Vincent van Quickenborne. He basically accepted the results of my study by admitting that there is indeed a problem. He said that the Belgian Gaming Commission simply does not have enough resources to go after every single one of these contraventions, and that some sort of law reform might be planned in the future. Now, what does the results of my study mean? Is this just a problem with poor enforcement? As the Belgian Minister of Justice has said, is this just because the Belgian Gaming Commission doesn't get enough money and can be resolved if they are given enough money? Or is the blanket ban approach to loot box regulation just not practically achievable? I think we need to think both domestically about this question inside Belgium and also internationally in general for the sake of other countries that might be considering emulating this approach. Can the Belgian Gaming Commission really enforce the ban better? How much would it cost to constantly monitor both the Apple App Store, the Google Play Store, and also other app stores for non-compliant games, and also game updates that are regularly made to the existing games? On the Apple App Store alone, there are 1 million games, and we do expect a lot of these games to receive regular updates that also need to be monitored. After these non-compliant games are identified, will the Belgian Gaming Commission invest the resources to actually criminally prosecute the companies that are non-compliant? That would again cost money, which might not be recoupable, especially if these companies are outside of Belgium and outside of the reach of Belgian law, effectively. One approach might be to shift the burden onto Apple to help the country enforce the law, given that the platform literally profits from illegal loot box sales in Belgium at the moment. We know that in China, video games are required to have a license, and that back at the end of 2020, the Chinese government told Apple to remove all of the video games that did not have a license. And as I understand it, a significant percentage of video games were removed because they did not have a license. I would suggest that that was a previous case where Apple did comply with specific requirements that a national government set out for it. So perhaps Belgium could consider something similar. The implications of this study internationally is that other countries that are also considering banning loot boxes must consider whether or not its own gambling regulator or some other regulator will be able to enforce the law significantly better than the Belgian Gaming Commission. I would suggest here that this is unlikely. Indeed, there are many negative consequences to a ban on loot boxes. For example, there is the forbidden fruit effect. A product that is banned would actually appear more enticing to people. Secondly, there's the problem with stigmatization. Technically, buying loot boxes is a crime in Belgium now. If the Belgian Gaming Commission truly enforces the law, that would also require it to go after individual players that are breaking the law. Now, this would lead to players who actually are suffering harm from loot boxes and needing help, deciding not to go and seek help because they will be afraid of being criminally prosecuted. Thirdly, this ban on loot boxes has made the Belgian version of certain games less fun because players must wait and play effectively the free-to-play version of the games, and they cannot spend a small and probably harmless amount of money to make their gameplay experience better. Fourthly, there's also the problem that this ban is rendering Belgian players uncompetitive on the esports scene, because many esports games actually require players to purchase loot boxes to be in any way competitive. For example, in Hearthstone, it is not possible to be competitive unless you buy a lot of card packs and have nearly all the cards available to you. So some conclusions from this study. An unenforced ban is obviously bad. And secondly, enforcing an effective ban is going to be very costly. We actually don't know what percentage of players are at risk of harm. In my opinion, I think we're looking at less than 10% of all players. So this ban and the costs that are associated with implementing a ban are not necessarily justified. The most dedicated players, who in my opinion are most at risk of harm because they will most likely spend the most amount of money on these video games, will circumvent any measures that a country or a region tries to put in, as long as there is another version of that game that they can access, because that is how much they want to play that particular game. Dare I suggest that loot boxes can't just be banned, and they are probably not going away, and that we need to regulate them in a different way. Banning loot boxes is actually a very extreme approach to regulation. It is very restrictive. There are other approaches. For example, in China, a different approach has been adopted, that is requiring video game companies to make probability disclosures. So loot box sales are not regulated or restricted. Instead, companies are required to make loot boxes more transparent and to allow players to make more informed purchasing decisions. Now, of course, I found flaws with this regulatory approach, but this is something that could be considered instead of a ban. Another approach to loot box regulation that I've been advocating for is for companies to design their loot boxes in more ethical ways and to create safer loot boxes that are less likely to harm. For example, all items could be given to players after they spend a predetermined amount of money. However, I do realize that there are also similar enforcement problems with this approach if this is imposed as law. However, I think to start with, we can try to convince companies to voluntarily design their loot boxes better. And I think we are seeing some companies doing this. Yes, thank you very much for listening. I will take any questions now, but if you have any further questions, please feel free to get in touch with me using any of these methods. Thank you very much.